Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating and chilling tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. A mysterious disappearance, a hidden conspiracy, and a powerful elite intent on keeping their secrets buried. This is no ordinary case for Sherlock Holmes. Don't forget to subscribe, for the mystery is only beginning. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, the vanishing stranger of Pall Mall. The fog hung thick over Wyndham like a heavy shroud, swallowing up the streets and cloaking the town in an unnatural silence. It was the sort of fog that felt alive, curling around lampposts and creeping into every corner, thickening the air until it almost seemed to press against the chest. As the carriage rumbled slowly over the cobblestone streets, Sherlock Holmes surveyed the small town from the window, his keen eyes darting over every detail. The town itself seemed like an anachronism, frozen in time, with narrow streets and towering buildings that loomed like silent sentinels. The buildings seemed huddled together, as though they were trying to protect themselves from something unknown. Holmes sat upright in the carriage, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the leather seat, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Dr. Watson shifted uneasily, the air in the carriage pressing upon him with an unspoken weight. Watson had grown accustomed to Holmes's quiet, measured demeanour, but this place, it was different. There was something in the air that made his skin prickle with unease. "Do you feel it, Watson?" Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a blade, his gaze still fixed on the dense fog outside. His tone was as crisp and calculating as ever, but there was an underlying tension that Watson had learned to recognise. It was a subtle crack in Holmes's normally unflappable exterior. "Feel what, Holmes?" Watson replied, trying to mask his own discomfort. "The pulse of the town. It's heavy, isn't it?" Holmes's lips barely moved as he spoke, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Watson. "There is something beneath the surface here. Something out of place." Watson shifted in his seat, glancing out the window toward the haphazard collection of buildings and narrow alleyways that lined the street. The residents, though few in number, moved with a quiet, almost furtive energy. He noticed the way they would glance up at the carriage, then quickly look away, their faces shadowed with suspicion. It was as if they knew Holmes's presence would unsettle whatever peace the town had left. The carriage came to a halt outside a modest tavern, its sign swaying gently in the wind, half obscured by the fog. Holmes stepped out first, his tall frame silhouetted against the mist, and Watson followed quickly behind. The wooden door creaked as they entered, the interior dimly lit by the flickering glow of candles and a low burning fire. The smell of damp wood mixed with the faint scent of tobacco smoke that lingered in the air. The noise of quiet conversation ceased for a moment as the two men entered, and several pairs of eyes turned toward them. Holmes stood motionless at the threshold, scanning the room with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes darted from face to face, assessing the subtle details. The way a man's hand tightened around his glass. The way a woman's posture stiffened as she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. It was as if the very atmosphere had shifted with their entrance, and Holmes relished the slight discomfort in the air. "Sherlock Holmes," he announced with his usual composure, his voice carrying across the room with unshakable confidence. He paused just long enough for the name to settle in, for people to whisper behind their hands, then continued. "I trust you are all familiar with my work." His words were not a question, but a statement, as though everyone in the room knew who he was, who they were. A man seated at the bar cleared his throat, lowering his drink. "Aye, I've heard the name," he muttered. His voice was rough, the accent thick with local pride. "But I reckon you'll find Wyndham a bit different from your usual cases, Mr. Holmes." "I am sure," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing slightly, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But I suspect the difference will be precisely what makes it interesting." Watson, ever the skeptic but now more intrigued by Holmes's air of confidence, took a seat near the fire. The tavern was warm, the flames flickering in the hearth casting a soft glow across the room. It was a small comfort amidst the growing unease that hung in the air. He could not shake the feeling that they had arrived in Wyndham at a time when the town was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to come. Holmes, however, was already lost in thought, his eyes flitting across the room. He studied the others with a perceptiveness that felt invasive, the silence between them heavy as they avoided his gaze. The tavern's occupants spoke in hushed tones, their whispers barely audible over the crackling fire. A faint sound broke the stillness, a soft, almost imperceptible knocking at the door. Holmes's gaze snapped to it with the precision of a hawk tracking its prey. The door opened slowly, and a man entered, tall, with dark, unruly hair and a brooding expression. His eyes scanned the room, locking onto Holmes for a brief moment before he lowered his gaze. "You've arrived," the newcomer said in a voice that held a mixture of resignation and unease. "I hope you're prepared for what's to come, Mr. Holmes." Holmes studied the man with interest, his sharp eyes catching every subtle detail. The way the man's jaw clenched, the faint tremor in his hands, the underlying tension in his posture. This was no ordinary visitor. Whoever he was, he had knowledge that could prove crucial to the mystery Holmes had unknowingly stepped into. "I am prepared," Holmes said simply. "But I must admit, I have yet to understand the true nature of the matter at hand. Perhaps you can enlighten me." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the others in the tavern, as though seeking permission. When no one intervened, he took a hesitant step forward. "There's been a disappearance," he said, his voice low, as if the very word might summon something darker. "A local artist, Edmund Reeve. He's been missing for days, and some say there's more to it than just his vanishing." Holmes stood silent for a moment, his mind already racing. Missing person cases were common, but something about the man's words struck a chord. Wyndham was hiding something, and Holmes had every intention of uncovering it. "I see," Holmes murmured. "Tell me more." The man took a deep breath and began to explain, but before the details could fully unfold, Holmes was already lost in thought. The fog outside, the cold air, the strange sense of unease. It was all beginning to fall into place. There was a puzzle here, and Sherlock Holmes was ready to solve it. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth an almost unsettling contrast to the cold fog pressing against the windows of the tavern. Holmes remained still, his back straight and his hands folded neatly before him, as the man, who had introduced himself as Thomas Hale, continued to speak in hushed tones. His words carried an undeniable weight, and yet Holmes felt the man's nervousness, his every glance betraying a hint of fear. It was not the usual fear of a man whose friend or loved one had gone missing. It was something deeper, more entrenched in the very fabric of the town itself. "Edmund Reeve?" Hale's voice trailed off, his gaze flickering toward the door as if expecting someone. He seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing. "He wasn't just a mere artist, Mr. Holmes. He was, well, a lot of things to different people. But recently, he had begun making waves. That's when the trouble started." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Hale, the slight twitch of the man's fingers betraying the nervousness he tried to mask. Watson, seated nearby, couldn't help but notice the tension in the room, the subtle shifts in the posture of the tavern's patrons, the way they glanced at one another when Hale spoke. It was as though the entire room shared some unspoken understanding, one that Holmes was quickly beginning to unravel. "Making waves?" Holmes repeated, his voice calm but carrying an edge that indicated his growing interest. "In what manner?" Hale hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak further, but Holmes's gaze was relentless. It was the sort of look that made one feel as though they were under an invisible microscope, with every detail of their character laid bare for judgment. The pause lingered for an uncomfortable moment before Hale sighed and lowered his voice even further. "He had found something," Hale whispered, glancing toward the back of the tavern, where the shadows were thickest. "Something buried in the town's past. Something no one wanted found." Holmes's eyes flashed with a quiet intensity. "Something buried?" "Yes," Hale continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "Edmund believed there was a hidden truth, something about the town's history. He started to ask questions, visit old records, speak to people who'd rather have been forgotten. He was... Hale's voice faltered, and he seemed to gather his resolve before speaking again. He was uncovering things that weren't meant to be uncovered. "And you?" Holmes asked, his tone still calm, but it carried a note of accusation now. "What role did you play in all this?" Hale stiffened, the colour draining from his face for a split second before he straightened himself and shook his head. "I didn't know. I swear it, Mr. Holmes. I didn't know the depths of what he was digging into. We were friends, but we were never close enough for me to understand the extent of it." He kept things to himself. Holmes absorbed this information carefully. "So, you claim to have no knowledge of what Reeve might have uncovered?" Hale's eyes darted nervously to the side, and Holmes caught the briefest flicker of guilt before the man nodded, though not with full conviction. "No, I don't know for sure. But I can tell you this much. When Edmund began his investigation, things in Wyndham changed. People got uncomfortable, tense. And then, after he disappeared, it got worse. Much worse." Watson, having listened closely to this exchange, leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean by worse?" Before Hale could answer, the door to the tavern swung open with a force that caused several of the occupants to flinch. A tall man with a wide-set jaw and a heavy coat strode in, his boots making a sharp, echoing sound on the wooden floor. His presence was imposing, and as he entered, the conversations in the room stilled. His gaze quickly fell on Holmes and Watson, and a shadow passed over his face. Holmes was the first to speak, his voice calm and calculated, his eyes piercing. "I assume you are here regarding the disappearance of Mr. Reeve." The man's posture stiffened as he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Holmes with an intensity that suggested he was sizing the detective up. "That's correct," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "Name's Barrington, Inspector Barrington, and I'll have you know, Mr. Holmes, that Wyndham doesn't take kindly to outsiders prying into matters that don't concern them." Holmes studied Barrington for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the room thickened, the flickering flames casting an eerie glow on the faces of those around them. The inspector's challenge was clear, his posture defensive and bristling with authority. But Holmes, ever unperturbed, merely raised an eyebrow. "I see," Holmes replied, his voice measured. "Well, as I understand it, the disappearance of Mr. Reeve has already drawn some attention. I'm simply here to lend my assistance in solving the matter." Barrington's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Hale spoke up nervously from his seat. "Inspector, we need him. Mr. Holmes, I mean. He's the best there is at solving cases. And this one's too strange for us to handle alone." For a long moment, the inspector and Holmes locked eyes, a silent battle of wills taking place in the quiet room. The others in the tavern held their breath, knowing that whatever transpired next could shift the balance of power in the town. Finally, Barrington gave a short, tight-lipped nod, his gaze softening just slightly. "Very well, Holmes," he said, his tone begrudging. "But mark my words, this town isn't as simple as it appears. Be careful where you tread." Holmes gave a slight nod in return, his expression unchanged. "I always am, Inspector." As Barrington turned to walk away, Holmes remained seated, his thoughts already racing. Hale watched him closely, still unsure of how much he could trust the detective. But something in Holmes's demeanour suggested that he would get to the heart of the matter, no matter what. After the inspector's departure, Holmes turned his attention back to Hale, his eyes sharp. "You've been withholding something. There's more to this story, Mr. Hale. I suggest you tell me everything." Hale swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I didn't want to involve you, Mr. Holmes, but it's worse than you think. Edmund wasn't just looking into the town's past. He was digging into the families that founded Wyndham, and he found something dark. And now, I think it's come back to claim him." Holmes's eyes narrowed, the faintest glimmer of understanding crossing his features. Something dark, he repeated. Something from the past. Yes, Hale whispered, his voice tight with fear. And I think the town wants to make sure it stays buried. The following morning, the fog hung even thicker than before, a persistent veil over Wyndham. The town seemed to sleep in a quiet stupor, as though the heavy mist muffled its every movement. Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Thomas Hale made their way along the cobbled streets toward the outskirts of town. The eerie quiet had settled over them once again, with only the occasional creak of a shutter or distant bark of a dog breaking the monotony. It was Hale who led them to the scene, his steps quick, though his face betrayed his growing discomfort. Holmes, his mind already working through the layers of what he had learned, moved with purpose, his long coat trailing behind him like a dark shadow. Watson followed, ever the observer, but with an unease in his chest that he couldn't shake. He had seen Holmes confront many mysteries, but something about the weight of this town, its secrets pressing down on them, felt different, almost personal. "We're nearly there," Hale said, his voice low. He wiped his brow nervously, glancing over his shoulder. Just be prepared." "For what?" Watson asked, his curiosity piqued but tinged with apprehension. Hale stopped at the edge of the street, his eyes darting from side to side. He was clearly hesitant to proceed, but after a long pause, he nodded toward a small clearing on the outskirts of Wyndham. Holmes and Watson followed as Hale led them through the damp underbrush and overgrown paths, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filling the air. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. Then they saw it. A small clearing opened before them, and there, lying on the ground, was the body of Edmund Reeve. Holmes immediately knelt beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with calculated precision. Watson, though less practiced in the art of observation, could not help but be struck by the grisly sight. The artist's body was twisted in an unnatural position, his limbs splayed out in an almost ritualistic manner, and there, beside him, etched in the dirt, was a strange symbol, a crude yet intricate design that looked both ancient and deliberate. The body's appearance, its arrangement, was something more than the work of a simple killer. This was a message. "Good God," Watson murmured, his voice tight with shock. Holmes did not respond at first. He was too focused, his eyes moving methodically over the body and the surrounding area. He reached for his magnifying glass, examining the symbol in the dirt with a precise and almost reverent air. His brow furrowed as he studied the mark, his mind already racing through possible explanations. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked, stepping closer, his breath shallow. "This," Holmes said softly, his voice low but charged with intensity, "is not just the scene of a murder. It's a ritual, a message." Watson's stomach churned. He had witnessed Holmes solve many mysteries, but this was something darker than he had expected. The body, the symbol, it spoke of a purpose beyond mere violence. Holmes remained still for a moment longer, his fingers delicately tracing the outline of the symbol, before he finally stood up, his expression unreadable. "I suspect," Holmes said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air, "that this town has been hiding more than just one secret, Watson. Edmund Reeve's death is the culmination of something far older, something much more sinister." "But who—" Watson began, his voice faltering. "Who could do such a thing?" Holmes turned to Hale, his piercing gaze fixing on the man. "You were right to bring me here, Hale, but this is no ordinary crime. We are dealing with something deeper, something that runs beneath the surface of Wyndham. But I need answers, and you will give them to me. What do you know of this symbol?" Hale recoiled slightly under Holmes's gaze, but he stood firm. I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I've never seen it before, not like this. But I've heard stories. Old stories." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Stories? Of what kind?" Hale swallowed hard, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's It's part of the town's history. Some say it's linked to the founding families, that it's some kind of ancient mark, a symbol from long ago. They say it was used in rituals, sacrifices. But no one talks about it openly. It's all just whispers. Things people don't want to remember. Holmes's gaze shifted from Hale to the body, his mind turning over the implications of what he had just heard. He crouched down again, studying the body with renewed intensity. The victim's expression was frozen in a grimace, his eyes wide in terror, as though he had known the end was coming. A cold chill settled over Holmes as he wondered just how much Edmund Reeve had uncovered before his untimely death. "There is much more to this story than meets the eye," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the others. "I will need to speak with others, but I suspect that the truth of this town's past is far darker than anyone is willing to admit." As Holmes stood up, Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. The air around them felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them could escape. Something was coming, and Wyndham, it seemed, was determined to keep its secrets buried, no matter the cost. The fog refused to lift as the day wore on, clinging to the streets and wrapping the town of Wyndham in a damp, suffocating embrace. Holmes and Watson returned to the inn, the weight of the morning's discovery pressing on them both. The atmosphere inside was just as oppressive, and the lingering sense of something unresolved settled over them like a thick, cold blanket. Holmes, though outwardly composed, was clearly deep in thought, his mind turning over the clues and contradictions that had already begun to surface. The symbol at the crime scene, the strange rituals Hale spoke of, and the unsettling history of the town. It was all connected, but the threads remained tangled, difficult to unravel. Holmes sat by the fire in the inn's small sitting room, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames as he turned the clues over in his mind. Watson, ever the companion, sat across from him, his own thoughts a swirl of unease. He had seen Holmes approach many cases with the sharp precision of a master, but this one felt different, darker somehow. He could feel it in his bones, the strange tension that hung over the town, and it was starting to gnaw at him. "Holmes," Watson finally ventured, breaking the silence that had lingered between them for what felt like an eternity. "What are we missing? There's something we're not seeing." Holmes did not respond immediately, his eyes still locked on the fire. Then slowly, he turned his gaze toward Watson, his expression unreadable. "We're missing the connections, Watson. We've been presented with pieces of a puzzle, but the true shape of it is still unclear." Watson frowned, leaning forward slightly. "You mean the symbol?" Holmes nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair. "Yes, that symbol. It's no coincidence. It's deliberate, not just a random mark left by a murderer. Someone wanted us to find it. But who? And why?" Watson thought about this for a moment. "It could be some sort of signature," he suggested. "A calling card left by the killer." Holmes shook his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded his friend. Number A signature would be too simple. "This is a message, Watson. A message meant to send us down a particular path. But what path?" Before Watson could respond, there was a soft knock on the door, interrupting their conversation. Holmes looked up, his expression still cool, though his posture shifted slightly as though he had been expecting this interruption. "Come in," he called, his voice steady. The door creaked open, and Hale stepped inside, his face drawn and pale. He looked as if he hadn't slept, his eyes wide and jittery, betraying the anxiety that clearly consumed him. He stepped into the room cautiously, glancing at Holmes and Watson before he spoke. I've found something," Hale said, his voice shaky. "Something that might help you." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the man's sudden urgency. "What is it, Hale?" Hale hesitated for a moment, clearly wrestling with something, but then he stepped forward, pulling a small bundle of papers from his coat. "It's a ledger. I don't know how it slipped my mind before, but I found it hidden in Edmund's studio. I thought it was just a collection of old sketches, but when I opened it, I realized it was much more than that. Watson leaned forward, his interest piqued. What sort of ledger? Hale unfolded the papers carefully, his hands trembling as he passed them to Holmes. It's a list. Names, dates, symbols, locations, and... He paused for a moment, swallowing hard. There's a reference to that symbol you found at the crime scene, and something about a ritual. I don't understand it all, but Edmund seemed to be tracking something important. Holmes took the papers from Hale with a precise, measured hand, his sharp eyes scanning the text with growing intensity. His gaze flicked quickly over the names, the symbols, the cryptic notations that filled the page. The symbols seemed to repeat, a pattern emerging that Holmes knew he had seen before. But where? His mind raced as he connected the dots, each new piece of information layering onto the last, building the image of something darker and far more complex than he had anticipated. Watson watched Holmes closely, the detective's expression unreadable as he flipped through the pages. There was a moment of silence, heavy with expectation, before Holmes spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "This is no ordinary ledger," Holmes murmured, his finger tracing a particular line on the page. "These are not just random names and symbols. These are key figures, individuals involved in something far older than this town, something buried deep in its past. Edmund was on the brink of uncovering a conspiracy, one that goes back centuries." Hale, still standing at the door, looked more nervous than ever. "A conspiracy?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What do you mean?" Holmes did not look up from the ledger. "This town, Mr. Hale, has more secrets than you realize. Edmund Reeve was not just an artist. He was someone who dug too deeply into the wrong history. And that history..." Holmes trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "That history is something the people of Wyndham are desperate to keep buried." Watson looked at Holmes, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. "You're saying Edmund's death wasn't just a random murder?" Holmes set the ledger down gently, his expression becoming more focused, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something far darker. "No, Watson. This was no random murder. Edmund was killed because he uncovered something he should not have. And now, it's up to us to figure out exactly what that was." As Holmes's words settled into the room, Hale shifted nervously, his gaze flicking to the door as though he might bolt at any moment. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes stood, the movement smooth and deliberate, his gaze still locked on the pages of the ledger. "Now, Mr. Hale, we begin by following the trail Edmund left behind, and I suggest we start with the names in this ledger. Someone in this town knows more than they're letting on." Hale's eyes darted nervously around the room. "But who can we trust? The town is full of people who..." "Trust no one," Holmes interrupted sharply, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "Everyone is a suspect, Mr. Hale. This is far bigger than we imagined, and I suspect that even the people closest to Edmund may be involved." Watson stood, sensing that the case was about to take a more dangerous turn. "What's our next move, Holmes?" Holmes turned, his expression grim. "We start by speaking to the people in this ledger. We find the connections, and we uncover the truth, no matter how dark it may be." The air was heavy with tension as Holmes, Watson, and Hale made their way back into the heart of Wyndham. The town seemed to have grown quieter since their last visit, though whether that was due to the weather or the weight of the discovery of Edmund Reeve's body, Holmes could not say. But one thing was certain: the atmosphere had shifted. People watched them as they passed, their gazes furtive, as though they were aware of the investigation unfolding, and yet were determined to remain as uninvolved as possible. Holmes did not miss the subtle way they avoided eye contact, the way they stepped back when he passed by. It was a small mercy, however, that not all of the townsfolk were so evasive. As Holmes and Watson entered the local office, where they were to meet several key individuals, there was a palpable sense of unease among those gathered. The small room was dimly lit, filled with the faint scent of ink and stale paper, the air thick with the unspoken tension that clung to everything in Wyndham. Holmes took his place at the center of the room, standing tall, his eyes sweeping over the group that had assembled. There was Mr. Finch, the mayor, whose usual politeness had dissolved into a tight, cautious silence. Mrs. Avery, the widow, whose demeanor was as inscrutable as ever, but whose hands now trembled ever so slightly. And then Sarah, the young woman who had appeared so fragile at the tavern, now visibly tense, her wide eyes darting nervously to each person present. Holmes folded his hands behind his back, his gaze cutting through the air like a blade. His voice broke the stillness like a sudden shock. Let us begin. Mr. Finch, Mrs. Avery, Sarah, there is much to discuss. Edmund Reeve's death was no accident, as I'm sure you know. It was no ordinary murder, and I believe you all know far more than you've revealed. Finch cleared his throat, his hand hovering near the collar of his coat, as if he were adjusting something too tight. Mr. Holmes, he began, his voice thin and tremulous. We understand that you are here to assist us, but this town is, well, it's not used to outsiders coming in and making accusations. Holmes's eyes sharpened. I'm not here to make accusations, Mr. Finch. I am here to uncover the truth, and you are part of that truth, whether you like it or not. Mrs. Avery's eyes flickered toward Finch, her face pale and drawn. She remained silent for a moment before speaking in a voice low and controlled, yet her words carried an undeniable edge. I don't know what you expect of us, Mr. Holmes. Edmund was an artist, an eccentric, a man who stirred up trouble in a town that preferred its peace. He was never content with the ordinary. And yet, Holmes interjected, his voice smooth but penetrating, he was murdered in a way that suggests his search for something was far from ordinary. The symbol found at the scene, the ledger I've seen, it's all pointing to something far deeper than a simple act of violence. What was he searching for, Mrs. Avery? Her eyes narrowed, and Holmes could see the conflict warring within her. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she gave a slight shake of her head. I can't help you, she said softly, but with an unmistakable tremor in her voice. You're looking for answers in the wrong places. Holmes's gaze never wavered. And where precisely should I be looking, Mrs. Avery? Before she could respond, Sarah spoke, her voice trembling, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It's the town's history, she said in a soft, almost pleading tone. Edmund was right. There's something hidden here, something that's been buried for years. People are afraid to speak of it. But Edmund, he kept digging. Digging into what? Holmes asked, his voice rising slightly with the force of his curiosity. Sarah glanced nervously at the others in the room. Finch's face had grown pale, and Mrs. Avery's fingers had curled into tight fists, her knuckles white. But Sarah's gaze, though filled with uncertainty, was steady as she met Holmes's eyes. The families that founded Wyndham, there's something dark in their past. I don't know the details, but Edmund, he knew. He was getting too close to whatever it was that they're hiding. Holmes absorbed her words with a calm demeanor, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a spark of recognition. And you, Sarah? He asked, his voice deceptively soft. What did you know? Did you know of Edmund's investigations? Her face flushed, and for a moment Holmes could see the veil of innocence slip from her, revealing a much more conflicted expression. She was silent for a long time, the tension in the room mounting with every passing second. Finally, she shook her head, though it was clear she had more to say. I didn't know everything, she whispered. But he was changing. I could feel it. And I think he found something that scared him. Something that he didn't want to share with anyone. Holmes glanced over at Watson, who had been silent throughout the exchange, taking in the scene with an increasing sense of unease. It was clear to him that Edmund Reeve had unearthed something that the entire town was desperate to keep hidden. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing against them, but they were still so far from understanding the full picture. There is something else, Holmes said, his voice low, almost as if he were thinking aloud. "Something that connects all of you to Edmund's death. I can feel it in the air, the way you all behave, the way you avoid certain truths. It's not just fear of the unknown that's driving this, it's guilt." At this, Finch stiffened, his eyes darting towards Sarah before returning to Holmes. Mrs. Avery looked down, as if ashamed to meet his gaze. Sarah, however, did not flinch. Instead, her lips parted as though she were about to say something, but the words remained lodged in her throat. It was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, and in that silence, Holmes's mind raced, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape, one that was darker, more complex, and more dangerous than he had imagined. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the group. "I will speak with each of you individually," he said, his tone as calm and deliberate as ever. "But I will warn you now. If you withhold any more information, I will find out, and the consequences for your silence may be far worse than you think." The following days brought a sharp chill to Wyndham, as if the town itself were bracing for something unknown, something inevitable. The fog persisted, thickening the air and obscuring the details of everyday life. Holmes, ever watchful, had been conducting his interviews with methodical precision, collecting the pieces of the puzzle one by one. But as he continued to dig, contradictions began to surface. There was something off about the way the townspeople spoke, small discrepancies in their stories, fleeting hesitations that hinted at deeper, more deliberate secrets. Holmes stood outside the local library, the faint smell of old paper and dust clinging to the stone walls. Watson stood beside him, his breath visible in the crisp air as he adjusted his coat against the cold. The library itself appeared ancient, a towering structure that seemed to be made of more shadows than light. Holmes had requested access to the town's historical records, hoping to find something that might tie into Edmund Reeve's mysterious investigation. But as he studied the records, his thoughts became more clouded. There was something hidden in the archives, something deliberately overlooked, as if the town's history had been carefully curated to omit certain details. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you think they're all hiding something? All of them?" Holmes didn't immediately respond, his eyes still scanning the documents before him. He picked up a faded letter, its edges frayed and its ink smudged by years of neglect. As he read through it, his brow furrowed deeper. "It's not that they're all hiding something, Watson. It's that they've built a false narrative, a history that serves their purposes, and now that history is beginning to unravel." "What do you mean?" Watson asked, stepping closer to get a better look at the letter in Holmes's hand. Holmes set the letter down gently, his fingers brushing over the paper with reverence. This letter was written by one of the founding families of Wyndham, Decimus Finch to be precise. It references a ritual, something that was meant to be passed down through the generations. The town was founded on this tradition, you see, and Edmund, in his pursuit of the truth, began to uncover it. "So, you believe Edmund was murdered because of something he found in the town's past?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice colder now. "And there's more. I've also found references to a hidden ledger, a document that records the involvement of several key figures in town's dark history. But the details are scarce. The ledger itself is missing, of course." Watson was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. And yet, they all deny knowing anything about it. Every single one of them. Holmes's lips tightened as he rose from his seat, his sharp eyes scanning the library once more. "That's where the contradictions lie. You see, Finch, both Mr. Decimus Finch and his grandson, the current mayor, have all denied any knowledge of the ritual. But this letter, Watson, proves otherwise. The Finch family has known about it all along." "So, they've been lying?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They've been covering up the truth for all these years?" "Not just lying," Holmes replied, his voice now cold with certainty. "They've been complicit. The mayor is aware of the ritual, and his family has been involved in it for generations. But there's more. Mrs. Avery. She's not who she says she is. Her late husband, Edgar Avery, was one of the original participants in these rituals. And Sarah, well, Sarah is tied to all of this more deeply than she's willing to admit. Sarah? Watson repeated, his brows furrowing. But she seemed so innocent. So removed from all of this. Holmes gave a small, grim smile, his expression now filled with something like quiet triumph. That's precisely what they want you to believe. She's been groomed for something much darker. Before Watson could respond, the door to the library creaked open, and Hale stepped inside, his face drawn tight with anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I've come to warn you. There's something you need to know." Holmes looked up, his expression sharpening. "What is it, Hale?" Hale hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though checking to see if anyone was listening. "It's the Finch family. They've been watching you, all of you, ever since you started asking questions." Watson felt a chill run through him at the words, but Holmes merely raised an eyebrow. "Watching us? What does that mean?" "They know," Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know you're getting too close. I'm telling you, Mr. Holmes, if you keep digging, if you keep pushing, you won't leave here with the answers you're looking for." Holmes stood up, his gaze fixed on Hale with a level of calm that was almost unsettling. "I've never been one to run from danger, Hale, and neither will I now. If there is something to be found, I will find it. And I suggest you prepare yourself, because this town will not allow the truth to be exposed without a fight." Hale swallowed hard, his fingers nervously twisting the hem of his coat. "You don't understand. These people, they don't just want to keep their secrets hidden. They will do anything to protect them. Anything." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "I understand more than you think, Hale. And I'm more than prepared to face whatever comes." Hale's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Holmes. "I'm afraid you've already started something that can't be undone. I just wanted to warn you." With that, Hale turned and left the library, leaving the room in a heavy, oppressive silence. Watson exchanged a look with Holmes, but before either could speak, Holmes was already moving toward the door. "We've uncovered some of the truth, Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady, but tinged with a hint of something darker. "But I believe the deeper we go, the more dangerous this case will become." Watson stood still for a moment, then followed Holmes as the detective moved purposefully toward their next destination. The road ahead, it seemed, was paved with secrets that Wyndham would stop at nothing to protect. Holmes stood in the dim light of the room, his face set in a grim mask of concentration as he paced slowly back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. The fire had burned low, its faint glow casting long shadows against the stone walls of the library. The warmth it provided did little to ease the cold tension that hung in the air. Watson, seated by the hearth, watched his friend with a growing sense of unease. He had seen Holmes tackle cases before, but this one was different. Holmes had become increasingly absorbed in his thoughts, his focus narrowed to a point where the rest of the world seemed to fall away. Watson couldn't help but notice the flicker of something darker in Holmes's demeanor, something that told him this case was weighing heavier on the detective than he cared to admit. "Holmes," Watson ventured, his voice quiet but urgent, "you're making yourself anxious. You've been pacing for hours." Holmes halted mid-step, his sharp gaze locking onto Watson's. His eyes, though tired, burned with an intensity that made the doctor hesitate. "I am not anxious, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice low and measured. "I am simply considering the facts, and I do not like what they are telling me." Watson watched as Holmes resumed his pacing, the silence between them deepening. It wasn't just the town's past that Holmes was unravelling. It was the pattern of deceit that had woven itself through the people of Wyndham, their lies building upon lies until the truth had been buried so deeply that no one dared to acknowledge it. Holmes had made connections between the families, the rituals, the symbols Edmund had uncovered, and the strange behaviour of the town's residents. Yet despite all the evidence, one thing remained elusive: the full extent of the conspiracy and the identity of the true culprit behind Edmund's death. "Holmes," Watson said, interrupting the detective's thoughts, "you've gathered all the evidence, but you haven't formed a solid theory yet. What do you believe happened to Edmund?" Holmes paused again, this time turning to face Watson, his gaze piercing. "I have formed a theory, Watson. In fact, I have several, but none of them are complete. Edmund was murdered, that much is certain. But the question remains, why was he killed? And who was responsible?" Watson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And what's the answer? Who would have wanted him dead?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, though it lacked the usual warmth that accompanied such expressions. "You see, Watson, that is the problem. The more I examine this case, the more I realize that we are not simply dealing with a single murderer. We are dealing with a network, an intricate web of lies, motives, and secrets. Edmund was not just an artist, he was a threat. He threatened to expose the truth about Wyndham's founding families, about the rituals they have perpetuated for centuries. These families, Watson, they are bound by a history of power, secrecy, and control. Edmund uncovered something they couldn't afford to have revealed. That is why he was killed." "But why?" Watson pressed. "Kill him in such a public way? Why leave the body exposed and marked with that symbol?" Holmes exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as though the answer was just beyond his reach. "That symbol," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of his deductions, "is a key. It's not just a mark left by the killer. It is an invitation, a message, meant to draw attention to Edmund's investigation. Whoever is behind this murder wanted to send a clear warning. But to whom? To us? Or to someone else?" Watson's mind raced as he absorbed Holmes's words. "So, you're saying that Edmund wasn't just killed by a random murderer. He was executed with purpose." "Exactly," Holmes said, turning to face the hearth once more, his eyes distant. "It's becoming clear that Edmund's murder was not simply to silence him, but to send a message to anyone who might dare uncover the truth. And that, Watson, points to someone within the very fabric of Wyndham itself. A person with both the means and the motive to control the flow of information." As Holmes's words hung in the air, Watson could feel the weight of them, the growing certainty that they were only scratching the surface of something far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. Holmes's mind was racing now, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with frightening clarity. He began to speak, almost to himself, his tone now filled with a quiet intensity. "There are 3 key figures who stand out," Holmes continued, his voice low, his words deliberate. "Mr. Finch, the mayor, his family's legacy is tied directly to the rituals Edmund was investigating. Mrs. Avery, she holds a key role in the history of Wyndham, and her late husband's involvement in these rituals is undeniable. And then there is Sarah. At first, I thought she was an innocent bystander, someone simply caught up in the web. But now, I believe she is more deeply entangled in this conspiracy than she has let on. She is part of this, Watson, and I suspect that she holds the final piece of the puzzle." Watson was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of Holmes's words. "You think Sarah is involved?" Holmes nodded, his gaze unwavering. "She's not just a victim of circumstances. She knows more than she's letting on. She's been groomed for something, perhaps a role in the rituals themselves. But what that role is, I cannot say yet." Watson leaned back, his mind struggling to keep up with the speed of Holmes's deductions. "So what's the next step, Holmes? What do we do now?" Holmes looked at him, his expression thoughtful, but there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, a quiet resolve that suggested he had already made up his mind. "We need to confront the families, Watson. We need to force them to reveal what they know, to show us their secrets, and for that, we will need to push them to their breaking point." He turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he watched the fog swirl outside. "I have a plan. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe. But I believe it is the only way we'll get the truth." Watson rose from his chair, his face set with determination. "Then let's begin. The sooner we confront them, the sooner this will all be over." Holmes turned back to face him, a fleeting look of approval crossing his features. "Indeed, Watson. But be warned, this is only the beginning. We are about to stir the hornet's nest, and I fear we will not be the only ones looking for answers." The tension in Wyndham had reached its breaking point. The fog that had once been a mere backdrop to the town's quiet existence now seemed to suffocate it, enveloping everything in an oppressive, almost sinister stillness. Holmes, Watson, and Hale stood together in the heart of the town, the weight of their investigation pressing down upon them like a physical force. They had followed the trail, piecing together the evidence with increasing clarity. Each new piece of information had only deepened the mystery, unraveling a web of lies, betrayals, and long-buried secrets. Now, the moment had come, the moment when everything would be revealed. Holmes was calm, his usual composure unshaken, but there was an unmistakable edge to his demeanour. The room they had gathered in, the sitting room of an old manor, was dimly lit, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air had thickened in anticipation. Holmes stood at the centre, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the group of suspects gathered before him. There was Mr. Finch, the mayor, his face pale and drawn, his eyes flicking nervously toward the others in the room. Mrs. Avery, the widow, was seated in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression unreadable but taut with tension. Sarah, the young woman who had once seemed so innocent, stood near the window, her back to them, her shoulders tense and rigid. The room felt suffocating, the silence thick with unspoken words. Holmes glanced around the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every flicker of nervousness, every subtle shift in posture. He could feel the secrets pressing against the walls, and he knew with a certainty born of years of practice, that the time for half-truths and evasions was over. "We are here, at last, to speak the truth," Holmes said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. The murder of Edmund Reeve was not just the act of a single individual. It was the culmination of a conspiracy woven into the very fabric of Wyndham's history. His words hung in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, Mr. Finch straightened, his face flushing with a mixture of fear and indignation. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Holmes," Finch spat, his voice shaking with barely concealed anger. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you. Edmund was a fool, a troublemaker who couldn't let well enough alone. He's the one who put himself in danger." Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "That is a lie, Mr. Finch. Edmund was not the fool. The fool is the one who thinks they can bury the truth forever." He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Finch's with unflinching intensity. "You and your family have been hiding the truth for generations, haven't you? The rituals, the power, the control period." Finch's expression faltered, and for the first time, Holmes saw the fear that had been lurking beneath the veneer of authority. "I don't know what you're implying," Finch said, his voice now noticeably quieter, his confidence cracking under Holmes's scrutiny. Holmes turned his attention to Mrs. Avery, who had remained silent throughout Finch's outburst. "You knew, didn't you, Mrs. Avery? Your husband was involved in these rituals. He was part of the legacy of control and power that this town has built upon." Mrs. Avery's face went white, her hands trembling in her lap. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but the words failed her. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze shifting from Holmes to Finch and back again. The weight of her silence spoke volumes. "Answer him," Holmes urged, his voice low and firm. "Answer for what you've hidden." Finally, Mrs. Avery's lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that trembled with fear and resignation. "Yes," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. Yes, Edgar. My husband. He was involved. But it wasn't what you think. He was trying to stop it. He wanted to expose it all. Holmes stepped back slightly, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. Stop it? He was trying to end the rituals? She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He didn't believe in it anymore. He wanted to end it. But he was silenced before he could do anything. And Edmund... Her voice broke, and she struggled to regain her composure. Edmund knew too much. He had begun asking questions. He was going to expose everything. He was going to expose us all. The room seemed to hold its breath as the truth began to unravel. Holmes turned toward Sarah, who had remained eerily silent throughout the exchange. She had been the last piece of the puzzle, the one who held the key to understanding the full extent of the conspiracy. She stood by the window, her back rigid, her hands clasped tightly at her sides. Sarah, Holmes said, his voice soft but firm. It's time for you to tell me the truth. You're part of this. You've been groomed for something. Sarah's shoulders trembled, and for a moment she did not respond. Then, with a quiet sob, she turned to face them, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. I didn't want to be part of this, she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't want any of it, but they told me I had no choice. They made me part of their plans. They made me part of the ritual. Holmes stepped toward her, his expression one of quiet understanding. And the symbol, Sarah? The one left at the scene of Edmund's death? What does it mean? Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head, her voice barely audible. It's the mark of the chosen, the ones who are part of the legacy, the ones who can continue it. Edmund was never meant to see it, never meant to uncover it, but he did. And now, her voice cracked, her face pale with horror. Now he's dead because of it. Holmes stood still, absorbing the weight of her confession. The pieces were falling into place with a clarity that was almost overwhelming. The rituals, the legacy, the power that had been passed down through generations of Wyndham's most influential families. It was all connected, tied together by a dark history that had been buried for far too long. And now, finally, the truth had been revealed. The truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating the room as Holmes, Watson, Hale, and the gathered townsfolk stood in the dim light of the manor. The flickering fire in the hearth seemed almost distant, its warmth no match for the chill that had settled over everything. The faces of Mr. Finch, Mrs. Avery, and Sarah were drained of colour, their expressions a mixture of guilt, fear, and resignation. Edmund's death had exposed the festering wound of Wyndham's dark past, and now, with the truth laid bare, there was nothing left to hide. Holmes stood in the centre of the room, his arms folded, his eyes still as sharp as ever, but the weight of the revelation hung upon him too. The mystery that had seemed so complex, so elusive, had finally unravelled. But at what cost? Lives had been shattered, secrets brought to light, and a dark legacy, one that had been carefully concealed for generations, had been thrust into the open. Mr. Finch, Holmes began, his voice calm but carrying a depth of finality. You and your family have been complicit in the rituals that have poisoned this town for centuries. You've kept the truth hidden, using power and fear to control those who might threaten your legacy. Finch stood rigid, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. His face, once flushed with indignation, was now ashen. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice hoarse. It's been this way for generations. The ritual, the power, it was all meant to protect Wyndham, to ensure that it thrives. Holmes's gaze never wavered. You call it protection. I call it tyranny. Edmund Reeve was a man who sought to free this town from the chains of its own history. He paid with his life for uncovering the truth, and now you will face the consequences of your actions. Watson felt a cold shiver run through him as the silence in the room deepened. It was as though the entire manor itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. The moment was both a release and a beginning, as though the very air around them was shifting. Mrs. Avery finally spoke, her voice strained and filled with sorrow. "Edgar didn't want this," she said softly, her eyes lowered to the floor. "He didn't want any part of it anymore. But by the time he realized what he had become involved in, it was too late. And I was complicit. We all were." Her words hung in the air like a confession, the guilt palpable, but there was no solace in her tone. The truth had come too late. She had been a willing participant in the town's secrets, and the consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. Edmund had sought to stop it all, but in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. "Sarah," Holmes said, his voice quieter now, though still heavy with authority. "You've been caught in the web of your family's lies, but you are not without blame. You have a choice now, one that Edmund never had." Sarah lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes red from hours of weeping. She seemed like a shell of the person she had once been, innocence stripped away by the weight of the truth. "I didn't want it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted any of this, but they made me part of it. They chose me." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze softening for the first time during this confrontation. "You still have the power to change, Sarah. You can make amends, even now." For a long moment she met his eyes, her breath shaky, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. I don't know if I can," she whispered, as though the weight of her choices had become too much for her to bear. "But I'll try. I'll do whatever I can to make things right." The room remained silent, save for the crackling of the fire. No one spoke for a long while, as though the weight of the truth needed to settle within them before they could move forward. The families, once so secure in their secrets, now stood before Holmes, stripped of their power, their authority, their lies. The legacy of Wyndham's dark rituals had been exposed, and there was no going back. Hale, who had been silently watching the scene unfold, stepped forward. "What happens now, Mr. Holmes?" His voice was weary, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, an understanding that, though the damage had been done, there might still be a path to redemption. Holmes turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Now, Hale, we ensure that this town is no longer controlled by fear. We will expose the full extent of the ritual and bring those responsible to justice. And we will make sure that Edmund's death was not in vain. But the town, the people..." Hale's voice trailed off, uncertainty lingering in his words. "The town will have to come to terms with its past," Holmes replied firmly. "It will not be easy, and many will resist. But the truth, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. It will be a long road, but it's the only road forward." As Holmes finished speaking, Watson could see the weight of the revelation settle over everyone in the room. This was no ordinary case, no simple crime solved. The truth had been a long time coming, and now that it had been revealed, there was no going back. Wyndham would never be the same again. As the fire in the hearth sputtered and died, casting the room into shadows, Holmes stood motionless, his gaze turned toward the window. He had solved the mystery, uncovered the dark history of the town, and exposed the truth, but it had come at a cost. And as the quiet settled in around them, Watson could see the toll it had taken on his friend. Holmes's voice broke the silence once again, but it was quieter now, as though he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "This town, Watson, has been built on lies for too long, but now it must rebuild. And perhaps in time, the people of Wyndham will come to understand that the truth, no matter how painful, is the only way forward."